Okay, and now we move to Paolo Stellino, Istituto da Filosofia Nova, correct?
Institute.
Eh?
Institute.
I'm joking. Okay. Institute of Philosophy, Universidade da Nova, Lisbon, Portugal, will revolting against itself, philosophy and suicide.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Thank you very much, Carlo, for the invitation. Thank you for being there. I wanted to say three things. First thing, this talk is dedicated to my beloved friend, Anthony Weinspieler Jensen. Second thing is, so part of this talk comes from my 2020 book, Philosophical Perspectives on Suicide, and the chapter I have in the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Suicide. There I focus on freedom, on the relationship between freedom, free will, and suicide. Today I will rather speak about will and suicide. I also want to say that I must make a public confession. I was forced by Carlo to choose this horrible title, and I deny all responsibility for it. So I don't think that suicide implies a revolt of will against itself. That said, I will cut this quote, and yeah, this is Wittgenstein. So basically, okay, very briefly, the talk is divided in 4 sections. I will deal with Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and then I will present the contemporary attempt to pathologize suicide. And I will present their views of suicide in relation to will and free will. Okay, so let's start with Kant. Kant is not the first philosopher to claim that in committing suicide, a person makes an improper use of free will. In his Summa Theologiae, Aquinas claims that man cannot kill himself because the passage from the earthly life to the afterlife solely depends on God's power and will. Here you have the quote. What makes a man master of himself is having free will. He may accordingly manage his life in respect of all those things which go to make up this life, and this is the province of his free will. The passage from this life to a more blessed one is, however, not a matter subject to man's free will, but to God's power. A man may not, therefore, kill himself in order to pass into the more blessed life. Similarly, a man may not kill himself in order to escape from any of the miseries of this life. Like Aquinas, Kant also argued that in choosing suicide, man makes use of free will in an inappropriate way. Unlike Aquinas, however, Kant claimed not that suicide constitutes an abuse of God's will and power, but that it represents a negation and self-contradiction of freedom. This argument can be found in the Lectures on Ethics recorded by Collins. In the section of duties to the body in regard to life, Kant considers whether we have the right to dispose of our life. He begins by noting that the relationship between the body and life is not contingent, for, I quote, "the body is the total condition of life," end quote. We cannot slip out of one body and enter another. Among other things, this means that the use of our freedom is possible only through our bodies. If we destroy the latter by choosing suicide, we make use of freedom to destroy its condition. There is the body, thus employing freedom to abolish freedom. As Kant argues, however, this is a contradiction. This is the passage. So far, then, as anyone destroys his body and thereby takes his own life, he has employed his choice, German Willkür, to destroy the power of choosing itself. But in that case, free choice is in conflict with itself. If freedom, Freiheit, is the condition of life, it cannot be employed to abolish life, since then it destroys and abolishes itself. For the agent is using his life to put an end to it. Life is supposedly being used to bring about lifelessness, but that is a self-contradiction. Kant's use of two different terms, Willkür and Freiheit, is revealing of the fact that this passage contains two distinct but complementary arguments. The first argument focuses on the self-contradictory character of making use of something either to abolish that same thing, freedom understood as free choice being used to abolish freedom, or to bring about its contrary, life being used to bring about lifelessness. In both cases, a self-contradiction is produced. As Paul Gouillet remarks, the second argument depends on the supposition that life is the condition of freedom and freedom the condition of life. Life is the condition of freedom because it makes freedom possible. At the same time, freedom is the condition of life because it is what gives life its value. In the following, I will consider only the first argument. To begin with, it should be noted that, strictly speaking, suicide can neither bring with it nor abolish or destroy freedom. Indeed, both cases imply that the individual who dies by suicide continues to exist either as a free or as an unfree subject. This is obviously impossible since, as mentioned in the previous section, suicide brings about the death of the very individual who is supposed to continue to exist. To clarify this point, we can compare the case of a man who dies by suicide with the case discussed by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty of a man who sells himself into slavery. According to Mill, though the latter man makes a voluntary choice and therefore chooses what is desirable to him, he should not be allowed to do so, for, here's the quote, the principle of freedom cannot require that he should be free not to be free. It is not freedom to be allowed to alienate his freedom. The comparison between the two cases clearly shows that, whereas the man who sells himself into slavery makes use of freedom to abolish his future freedom and as a consequence lives as a man deprived of freedom, the man who dies by suicide employs freedom to bring about his death. To that extent, he ceases to exist and therefore does not suffer any loss or alienation of freedom. Kant's argument is not so easily refuted, however. A closer inspection of the passage quoted above reveals that the contradiction that arises from using freedom to abolish freedom is neither logical nor pragmatic in nature, but rather teleological. For to use freedom in this way is, according to Kant, to use it against, or in a way that is inconsistent with, its natural purpose. This is why, in the passage quoted above, Kant writes that free choice is in conflict with itself. To understand exactly why Kant thinks that suicide involves using freedom against its natural purpose, it is helpful to recall his definition of freedom in the practical sense in the Critique of Pure Reason, where freedom in the practical sense is described as the independence of the power of choice, Willkür, from necessitation by impulses of sensibility. According to Kant, man differs from animals in that his power of choice, arbitrium, is not necessitated but only affected by impulses of sensibility. This is why man can act freely, that is, independently of sensible impulses. In choosing suicide, however, man freely follows his inclinations, that is, he allows his person to be governed by them. In so doing, it thus uses freedom against its natural purpose, precisely because, as the passage from the Critique of Pure Reason makes clear, the correct use of the human power of choice involves freely determining oneself independently of necessitation by sensible impulses. To quote the lecture on ethics, anyone who allows his person to be governed by his inclination is acting contrary to the essential end of mankind, for as free agent he must not be subject to his inclinations, but should determine them through freedom. Kant's argument rests on the assumption that the man who chooses suicide freely follows his inclination, or, even worse, acts under the sway of sensible impulses, thus using freedom incorrectly, using his free will in a way that is contrary to its natural purpose. Needless to say, this view of suicide can be seen as biased and reductive, for there is no reason to deny a priori that the decision to die by suicide is sometimes made on the basis of rational and thoughtful deliberation, rather than the sway of inclination. This is a possibility that Kant does not seem to take into account, however, precisely because for him, the rational use of freedom implies that one must act according to objectively necessitating grounds that restrict the use of freedom and prescribe that any use of the power of choice must be compatible with the greatest use of it. This is the quote from the lecture of Ethics. Freedom, Freiheit's supreme rule is, in all self-regarding actions, so to behave that any use of powers is compatible with the greatest use of them. For example, if I have drunk too much today, I am incapable of making use of my freedom and my powers. Or if I do away with myself, I likewise deprive myself of the ability to use them. So this conflicts with the greatest use of freedom, that it abolishes itself, and all use of it as the highest principium of life. Only under certain conditions can freedom be consistent with itself. Otherwise, it comes into collision with itself. Section 2, Schopenhauer. Considering the whole history of Western philosophy, Schopenhauer is among the philosophers who devoted the most attention to the topic of suicide. Whether because of personal motives, the likely suicide of his father Heinrich Floris when the philosopher was only 17 years old, or philosophical reasons, the need to show that his pessimistic worldview did not justify or lead to suicide, Schopenhauer dealt with voluntary death in several passages in his oeuvre. His main work, The World as Will and Representation, contains a whole section, section 69, dedicated to suicide. There, Schopenhauer famously argues that suicide is useless, for it only destroys the phenomenon while leaving the thing in itself untouched. Allusion to this argument can be found in section 54, 59, and 65 of the same work. To this, one may add the fundamental role played by asceticism in negating the will. Indeed, scholars all too often overlook the fact that Schopenhauer considers death by voluntary starvation as a form of suicide. Eine besondere Art desselben. Thus, far from opposing any kind of voluntary death, Schopenhauer rather speaks favorably of one particular form of it as the only way to reach the complete negation of the will. As mentioned in section 69 of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer argues at length against the possibility of conceiving suicide as a definitive escape from suffering. Consisting in the abolition and destruction of the single individual appearance of the will, suicide is, I quote, a futile and foolish act, end quote, because it leaves the thing in itself untouched. To clarify his argument, Schopenhauer mentioned the occasional case of a father who, having decided to commit suicide, also takes the life of his children. The aim of this man is to rescue himself and his beloved children from the miseries and sufferings of existence. According to Schopenhauer, however, this man is caught in a delusion. Indeed, it takes appearance for the essence in itself. His act is thus useless and vain, since it destroys the individual appearance in a particular place and at a particular time, but leaves untouched the will, there is the thing in itself. Section 69 might be, however, read as containing a second argument against suicide, based on the alleged self-contradictory character of this act. Here's the passage. Far from being a negation of the will, this, suicide, is a phenomenon of strong affirmation of will. This is because negation is not essentially an abhorrence of the suffering of life, but an abhorrence of its pleasures. The person who commits suicide wills life and is only unsatisfied with the conditions under which life has been given to him. Thus, when he destroys the individual appearance, he is relinquishing only life, not the will to life. Schopenhauer's argumentation is grounded on the psychological interpretation of the suicide's inner motivation. According to Schopenhauer's explanation, it would be a mistake to think that the real driving force of suicide is the wish to deny life. On the contrary, a person who commits suicide because she can no longer bear the burdens of life still ardently wills life. If she were able to stop willing, that is, to abhor life's pleasures, she would probably not feel the need to take her life, or at least she would feel this need to a lesser extent, for she would not see the unsatisfied pleasures as a source of suffering. However, since she still wills life but is unable to satisfy her will, given the particular circumstances of her life, she commits suicide. The contradictory character of this act lies in the fact that the person denies life because she wills life. In a similar vein, Eugen Düring points out in his 1865 work Der Wert des Lebens that suicide does not necessarily imply a condemnation of life. On the contrary, it is love of life itself, Liebe zum Leben, which leads someone to prefer the sacrifice of his existence to the positive sensation of the lack of what he considers to be essential for his life. Schopenhauer's argument is very convincing and plausible qua explanation of the suicide psychology. However, it is less clear whether he intends it to function as a philosophical argument against suicide itself. Even if it does, the argument appears to apply only to cases in which the person who commits suicide still wills life. Indeed, considered from an empirical perspective, Schopenhauer's characterization of the motives leading individuals to suicide seems limited and reductive. It excludes, for example, altruistic suicides or those undertaken for political or religious reasons, cases that do not fit neatly within the narrow category of suicide from despair or suffering. This raises further questions. Does Schopenhauer regard such forms of suicide as morally permissible? Or is his claim that suicide is futile and self-contradictory meant to have universal scope? And what moral implications, if any, follow from describing suicide in these terms? Does this characterization entail that suicide is morally prohibited, or is Schopenhauer's objection better understood as metaphysical rather than moral, as Dale Jacquet suggests? Providing a full answer to this question will go well beyond the scope of this talk. Instead, I will focus on a more limited issue, whether for Schopenhauer suicide is a freely willed act or the result of an unfree choice. As is well known, Schopenhauer adopts Kant's distinction between empirical and intelligible character, a distinction that, in the resolution of the third antinomy, reconciles deterministic natural laws with moral freedom. As Schopenhauer states in his prize essay on the freedom of the will, I quote, "As an object of experience, the empirical character is, like the whole human being, a mere appearance, and so bound to the forms of all appearance, time, space, and causality, and subordinate to their laws. By contrast, that which, as thinking itself, is independent of these forms and so subordinate to no time distinction, and is therefore the enduring and unalterable condition and foundation of this whole appearance, is his intelligible character. There is his will as thing in itself, to which, in this capacity, there certainly also pertains absolute freedom. There is independence from the law of causality, as a mere form of appearances. This freedom is, however, transcendental. There is not occurring in appearance, but present only insofar as we abstract from appearance and all its forms, so as to reach that which, outside of time, is to be thought as the inner essence of the human being in itself. Within this framework, what we might call the ordinary suicide does not qualify for Schopenhauer as an expression of genuine transcendental freedom. On the contrary, as noted, he interprets it as an act still governed by the will to live. The agent remains determined by the motives of her will, namely the suffering imposed by life and dissatisfaction with the conditions under which it has been given to her. Only so far as we abstract from appearance and all its forms can we hope to attain freedom. This is where the importance Schopenhauer attributes to asceticism as a means of negating the will becomes clear. Only from this higher ethical standpoint can the agent be said to be free. However, if we recall that Schopenhauer also regards death by voluntary starvation as I quote, a form of suicide, it is not wrong to say that, for him, at least one particular kind of suicide may be understood as a freely willed act. Section 3, Nietzsche. Just as Schopenhauer recognizes only the negation of life as an absolute value, so Nietzsche acknowledges only one thing, life. With these words, Georg Simmel synthesizes the antithesis existing between Schopenhauer's pessimistic worldview and Nietzsche's Dionysian affirmation of life. It may therefore come as a surprise that Nietzsche was in fact far more open to suicide than Schopenhauer. For Nietzsche, there are no philosophical and, above all, moral valid reason to refute suicide. On the contrary, suicide is on certain occasions a wholly rational act. Even more surprising might be to know that Nietzsche, who denies the existence of free will, conceives of suicide as a free death, in German freier Tod, a neologism which will later give origin to the word Freitod, first used by the Austrian philosopher Fritz Mautner in 1906. The fact that the term free death only appears in the homonymous speech from the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra must not mislead about the importance of this notion for Nietzsche's view of suicide. Indeed, freedom is for Nietzsche one of the essential aspects, if not the most essential, that distinguish voluntary death from natural death, since the former, unlike the latter, is freely chosen. As the formula free for death, zum Tode, and free in death, from the Zarathustra indicates, the freedom to which Nietzsche alludes is not only a freedom to die, there is a freedom to give ourselves a voluntary death and to freely choose how and when, but also a freedom in dying. There is the freedom to assert for the last time one's autonomy. As Zarathustra puts it, my death I praise to you, the free death that comes to me because I want. The parallels with the Stoic tradition, particularly with Seneca, are striking. As Walter Engler points out, suicide is connected to three different conceptions of freedom in Seneca's writings. One, freedom from the vicissitudes of life, such as physical pain, debilitating disease, and the senility of old age. Two, freedom to act consistently and to preserve one's dignity. And three, freedom from fear of death. All three conceptions can be found in Nietzsche's view of suicide. In particular, like Seneca, Nietzsche sees suicide as a way to be consistent with one's beliefs and moral principles until the very last moment of one's life. Both philosophers establish a clear parallel between the one lives and the way one dies. As mentioned, it may come as a surprise that Nietzsche emphasizes the voluntary and free aspect of suicide if we consider that he repeatedly denies the existence of free will. In the second volume of Human Hold to Human, Nietzsche claims that, I quote, we are in prison, we can only dream ourselves free, not make ourselves free, end quote. Although the late Nietzsche seems to soften this hard determinist view, he nonetheless continues to reject the existence of free will, at least in its traditional sense. As he puts it in Twilight of the Idols, we no longer have any sympathy toward nowadays for the concept free will. We know only too well what it is, the most disreputable piece of trickery the theologians have produced, aimed at making humanity responsible in their sense, there is, at making it dependent on them. Thus, how can death be chosen freely and voluntary if human beings have no free will? To begin with, if we have a look at the key passage from section 21 of Beyond Good and Evil, we can see that Nietzsche rejects a specific conception of free will, namely the metaphysical notion that posits the human being into a causa sui. This is the passage. The causa sui is the best self-contradiction that has ever been conceived, a type of logical rape and abomination. But humanity's excessive pride has got itself profoundly and horribly entangled with precisely this piece of nonsense. The longing for freedom of the will in the superlative metaphysical sense, the longing to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for your action yourself and to relieve God, world, ancestors, chance, and society of the burden, all this means nothing less than being that very causa sui, and, with a courage greater than Münchhausen's, pulling yourself by the hair from the swamp of nothingness up into existence. Nietzsche's dismissal of metaphysical free will, as understood as the human being's absolute spontaneity to do good and evil, a clear reference to Kant's third antinomy, leaves open the possibility of less superlative conceptions of freedom. Without entering into a complex debate, it is worth noting that in a few passages, Nietzsche tends to associate the term free will to the notion of self-determination, German Selbstbestimmung. Thus, rather than dismissing this concept, he appears instead to reformulate it. Among other things, this reformulation of the concept of freedom of the will implies an understanding of freedom in terms of the capacity to give oneself values and laws. It is precisely in this sense that Nietzsche describes the sovereign individual from the second dissertation of the genealogy as a master of the free will, a free man, the possessor of an enduring, unbreakable will who has his own standard of value. Nietzsche's concept of free death appeals, mutatis mutandis, to a similar understanding. In his portrayal of free death, suicide is framed as a victory not only over death and illness, but also, indeed, above all, over traditional morality and Christianity, both of which condemn it. By choosing the moment of one's death, the individual asserts freedom and autonomy against external impositions. It is therefore no coincidence that the sovereign individual is described as one who, having emancipated itself from the morality of custom, becomes an autonomous supra-ethical individual. And this is a quote. Here, autonomous must not be understood in the Kantian sense, but rather in opposition to it. As Nietzsche insists, autonomous and ethical are mutually exclusive. And that's a quote again. Accordingly, far from negating free will, suicide represents, for Nietzsche, its highest affirmation. This happens when I go too quick. Okay, section 4. Last section, pathologizing suicide. The connection between suicide and insanity in Western society that dates back at least to classical antiquity. Ancient Greek physicians linked suicide to mania or melancholia, which were caused by an excessive concentration of yellow and black bile, respectively. Whereas for ancient Roman physicians, furor, acute madness, and insomnia, pathological insanity, could account for self-killing. However, the medicalization and pathologization of suicide is relatively recent, dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries. In his influential study on suicide, Durkheim mentioned Esquirol's remark that, I quote, "A man attempts self-destruction only in delirium and suicides are mentally alienated," end quote. And points out that Esquirol's opinion was shared by several of his colleagues in the 19th century. Although such a position may seem obsolete, it should be noted that, according to recent studies, most of those who die by suicide, approximately 90–95%, suffer from a detectable psychiatric disorder at the time of their death. Some scholars believe that this is an underestimate and that the remaining 5–10% either had an undetected mental disorder or experienced one or more subsyndromal mental disorders. In the majority of cases, this was depression. Other disorders associated with particular high rates of suicide are major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, anorexia nervosa, schizophrenia, substance abuse, and conduct disorder in youth. The conclusions drawn by these studies have clear relevance to the question we're dealing with. Indeed, philosophers tend to agree that free will can be limited in different ways. Mental disorders are often thought to be among these limiting factors. As Gerben points out, a clear connection between mental disorders and, quote, at the end of this quote, of this passage, an important loss of freedom is established in the introduction to the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. A similar connection can be often found in the philosophical debate on free will and moral responsibility, even in similar works that have shaped the debate. Mental disorders are thus taken as an example of a condition that limits free will and moral responsibility, perhaps even making them impossible. Taking into consideration what psychiatrists have to say about the close connection between mental disorders and suicide, and considering that philosophers usually mention mental disorders as a condition that can compromise free will, one may be tempted to conclude that the decision to take one's own life is usually, if not always, an unfree act, whose ultimate cause is to be found not in the agent's free will, but rather in her disordered mind. The act of suicide would thus be a false choice, the illusion of choice, as John Grohl suggests in a blog entry of Site Central. Non lo so, mi succede quando leggo troppo in fretta. For several reasons, they will be discussing what follows. This would be a hasty conclusion. Before we turn our attention to this problem, however, a few words must be said on the philosophical debate on free will. Anthony, do you mind reading at least a page? Sorry, I need to record my voice. Otherwise, it will be too boring.
No.
Thanks.
Should I do it in your voice?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do my impression. No, my glasses. No, my pleasure. You okay?
Yeah.
As is often acknowledged, the problem of whether humans have free will, and if so, to what extent and in what sense, is one of the very oldest and hardest problems of philosophy, end quote, as Thomas Pink puts it. What makes this problem so complex is that it is related to a cluster of philosophical issues that include, among others, the mind-body relation, the nature of rationality, problems concerning moral agency and responsibility, and general metaphysical issues about necessity, possibility, the laws of nature, and causation. Traditionally, the free will debate is a debate between three main, mutually exclusive views on free will. First, hard determinism, the view that all events are determined and that free will does not exist. I like that one. Two, libertarianism, which holds that we sometimes have free will and denies the truth of determinism. And third, compatibilism, or soft determinism, which holds that determinism is compatible with free will. The contemporary debate is obviously much more complex, but these main distinctions will suffice for present purposes. To begin with, it must be noted that the question whether suicide can, at least in certain occasions, be the result of a freely willed choice makes full sense only if one's starting point is not hard determinism, for, as mentioned above, this view holds that free will does not exist. For a hard determinist, the act of suicide is determined just like all other actions are. Therefore, asking whether suicide can sometimes be the consequence of a freely willed choice in a hard deterministic world would be like asking whether a specific apple contained in a box in which we know or believe there are only red apples is yellow. Thus, the question of the relationship between suicide and free will makes full sense only for soft determinists or libertarians. To answer this question, we must first and foremost clarify the concept of free will. That is no easy task. However, given that there is no consensus among researchers regarding how free will is best understood or defined, One finds several competing views of free will in the contemporary debate, and the answer to the question of whether suicide can ever be considered the result of a freely willed choice will vary depending on the exact notion of free will one is referring to. For our purposes here, ours is Paolo and I, we do not need to adjudicate these disputes. Suffice it to say that it is a significant problem that anyone who wishes to affirm the existence of free will, while at the same time claiming or denying that suicide is freely willed act, must face. You want it back?
Thanks.
Okay.
Stay here, please.
Oh, yeah, sure.
If you don't mind. As mentioned above, recent studies have shown that most of those who die by suicide had a detectable psychiatric disorder at the time of their death. If confirmed, these findings will call into question the typical philosophical picture of suicide, according to which suicide is the consequence of a reasoned and voluntary decision, and thus free in the same way that other reasoned and voluntary actions are free. Recently, however, doubt has been cast on the reliability of the empirical evidence on which these findings are based. The claim that 90–95% of those who die by suicide suffer from a detectable psychiatric disorder at the time of their death is based on a diagnostic tool called psychological autopsy, PA. As explained by Canava et al., this technique is based upon a combination of interviews of those closest to the deceased and an examination of corroborating evidence from sources such as hospital and general practice case notes, social work reports, and criminal records. Although PA is a valuable tool, many scholars claim that several methodological problems limit the value of the studies that are based on this tool, including the possibility of diagnosing someone who has died by interviewing someone else, the informant's mental state at the time of the interviews, the inevitable subjectivity of the informant's answers, the possible presence of bias and prejudice, the difficulty of distinguishing between normal sadness and depression or normal distress and mental illness, and the unreliability of mental health diagnosis. Hillman and Ali also point out that informants sometimes exaggerate symptoms to retrospectively interpret and justify the suicide, thereby reducing their feelings of guilt. The same authors categorically conclude that, I quote, as a tool to assign psychiatric diagnosis to dead people by interviewing proxies, PA studies are methodologically flawed. PA studies can therefore not serve as an evidence base for the claim that most people who die by suicide are mentally ill. It should be noted that the often presupposed connection between mental disorder and suicide is problematic not only given the nature of the empirical evidence available to us, but also because of a certain circularity deriving from the fact that suicidality is contained in the diagnostic criteria of some mental disorders. As Anne Tutmau notes, the inclusion of suicidality among the diagnostic criteria of some forms of mental disorder makes the association between mental disorder and suicidality more likely and to some extent self-fulfilling, given that, at least in some cases, that same association is already presupposed in the criteria on the basis of which the mental disorder is diagnosed. This means that the connection between mental disorder and suicidality is to some extent conceptual, being, I quote again Monk, partly, though not wholly, a result of the way suicidal behavior is presupposed to be mentally disordered behavior. The implicit normative assumption that suicidal behavior is mentally disordered behavior has gained much force in recent years, becoming a kind of gospel in the specialty of psychiatry, as Ben Rich puts it. This pathologizing approach has an important bearing on how the relationship between suicide and free will is understood. Indeed, mental illness is usually associated with irrationality, cognitive incoherence, and a lack of decisional capacity. With this paradigm, suicidal thoughts are considered to be the consequence of a pathological condition, rather than resulting from rational and autonomous deliberation. though the exact nature of the link between suicide and mental illness is often left unexplained. However, many scholars have shown that the diagnosis of a mental disorder does not necessarily imply that a patient is unable to make intentional or reasonable choices, and is thus incapable of free and autonomous agency. Without denying the devastating effects that mental disorders can have on a patient's ability to make well-informed and authentic choices, it is important to emphasize that it would simply be wrong to assume that the mentally ill are always and indiscriminately coerced by their mental illness into suicide. Thomas Joyner has rightly warned against a simplistic view of the association between mental disorders and suicidality, which does not explain why only a small percentage of people with mental disorders attempt or die by suicide, approximately 4 to 8%. And why suicide rates vary according to geographic area and social, cultural, and ethnic group affiliation. Suicide is a complex phenomenon that has a wide range of causes and is conditioned by several socio-cultural factors. To assume a direct causal connection between mental disorder and suicide is to fail to acknowledge that the latter phenomenon is multidimensional and multifactorial. More importantly, an excessively medicalized and pathologized approach to suicide may lead to the exclusion of the possibility of non-pathological suicidal thoughts by definition, limiting the spectrum of the kinds of autonomous decisions rational beings can make. The risk of paternalism is particularly significant when it comes to physician-assisted suicide. Indeed, as Rich points out, terminally ill patients who express a desire to hasten death as a means of bringing an end to the great pain and suffering they are experiencing are at grave risk of being diagnosed as clinically depressed with suicidal ideation by mental health professionals and may therefore be considered unable to make a well-informed and authentic choice as to whether to go on living, enduring refractory suffering until their death. Thus, paradoxically, the problem seems not to be whether mental illness deprives human beings of their free will, as shown above. The mere presence of a mental disorder does not imply that the agent lacks autonomy, moral responsibility, or the capacity to make decisions, or the percentage of suicide cases in which evidence of a mental disorder is detected. Recent studies suggest that this percentage could be much lower than initially supposed. Rather, the problem is to what extent an excessively medicalized and pathologized approach to suicide risks robbing human beings of their autonomy and free will. Should I skip the conclusion, Carlo? Okay, it's very brief. Is suicide a freely willed act, or is it the consequence of an unfree choice? As I tried to show in this talk, philosophers have given different answers to these questions. Broadly speaking, there would seem to be a correlation between how one views suicide in relation to free will and the position one takes in what Margaret Battin calls the Stoic Christian divide about the individual's role in his or her own death. Seneca and Nietzsche, two staunch defenders of suicide, viewed suicide as a way of gaining freedom and preserving one's ethical self-consistency. Following their example, Jean Emery defined suicide as a liberty in the most extreme and final form and a breath-giving road to the open, German ins Freie. Despite the differences that divide them, these authors agree that suicide can be considered the highest expression of one's freedom and will. On the other side of the divide, Christian authors like Aquinas and Kant argued that in choosing suicide, man makes an inappropriate use of free will. Kant in particular claims that the act of suicide represents a self-contradiction of freedom insofar as the person who dies by suicide employs freedom in order to abolish freedom, an argument that has sometimes been used in the contemporary debate. Such a choice is morally impermissible, however, for freedom should not be used against its natural purpose, but must, on the contrary, be employed according to objective rules that restrict its use. Furthermore, freedom has absolute value and thus ought never to be abolished. It should be noted that, despite their different understandings of the relationship between suicide and freedom, the philosophical views mentioned above fundamentally agree on one point. They tend to think of suicide as the consequence of a more or less voluntary and freely willed act. Schopenhauer breaks with this picture. Indeed, as we have seen, he maintains that suicide, far from constituting a negation of the will, is instead an expression of its strong affirmation. The person who commits suicide still wills life, but is dissatisfied with the condition under which it has been given to them. The will to live thus provides the motive that determines the agent's action, and the agent is therefore not genuinely free, at least not in the transcendental sense of freedom. Only through the negation of will, exemplified by voluntary starvation, which Schopenhauer himself classifies as a form of suicide, can the agent be said to be truly free. Albeit for very different reasons, modern attempts to pathologize suicide likewise tend to portray the act as the result of an unfree choice. Indeed, as noted, according to recent studies dedicated to exploring the relationship between mental disorders and suicide, based on the so-called PA methodology, approximately 90–95% of those who die by suicide had a detectable psychiatric disorder at the time of their death. If confirmed, these findings could seriously call into question the traditional picture of suicide as the consequence of a freely willed choice. As shown in this talk, however, several doubts have recently been cast on the reliability of PA studies. Thus, until more solid empirical evidence is presented, there is little reason to assume that there is a strong and pervasive link between suicide and mental illness, or to conclude that most, if not all, cases of suicide are the result of an unfree act. To conclude, although merely indicative, the analysis developed in this talk suggests that the question of whether suicide is a freely willed act or the result of an unfree choice admits no straightforward answer and depends on a range of factors. To begin with, there are very different ways in which we might describe suicide as an act of freedom. There is an obvious difference between asserting that suicide is a free act as a claim about free will, or it's being a path to freedom in Seneca's sense, or asserting this from an existentialist perspective, for example. The same goes for the notion of free will, the definition of which, as we have seen, remains a matter of contention among philosophers. Other considerations may also prove important, such as whether one accepts the distinction between empirical and intelligible character, as Kant and Schopenhauer do. Depending on these central aspects and how we understand and define freedom and free will, we will likely think that suicide constitutes either a supreme affirmation or an undeniable negation and self-contradiction of freedom and will. Thanks. Carlo.
We have a super short
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes for the questions, unfortunately. So yes, telegraphic, straight to the point questions. Please. Sophia.
Very quickly then. I really like the quotation from Schopenhauer you presented when he says that if one committed suicide, it's not because he is not attached to life, but is attached to life, but is dissatisfied with the present condition. And then you said that the present studies contradict the idea that suicide is a free choice. I was wondering whether these studies can be used also to contradict Schopenhauer, because given the description you gave of major depression, I wouldn't say that a person who has major depression is someone who is attached to life but is dissatisfied with the present condition. It seems more the description of a person who has no desires anymore. So it's not just the present life that is dissatisfying, it's just that he's not interested anymore in anything almost. So I was wondering whether this may be used even to contradict Schopenhauer. Yeah.
Very, very briefly, I think it depends on what kind of mental disorder we're talking about, and on other factors as well. How conscious is the patient or the agent? I clearly recall a person I knew that had I think it was a bipolar mental disorder, and she was still attached to life, though she was willing to commit suicide. So in this case, I think this is precisely the situation Schopenhauer describes. So my short answer would be, it really depends on which mental disorder are we talking about and specific situation. Very briefly.
Another question, telegraphically done.
I wish only precise that obviously Socrates didn't make a suicide, which is the reason I think it's very important to precise this, because he accepted a condemnation by Athens. For moral reason, he didn't escape. In this story, we have another side, a very important one of will, that is the will of accepting the death we cannot escape. The same we find after in Seneca. And I think that is a very important actual point now, because no one talks about this side of our will. Our learning to accept our death, inevitable death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Actually, this is a very complex question. My very quick answer would be, this mainly depends on how you define suicide. And this is a huge debate in the literature on suicide, on philosophy of suicide. Did Christ commit suicide or not? Cristo. Did Christ commit suicide or not? Depends on how you define suicide. The problem is that we tend to either sympathize or dislike suicide. And then we say, no, this was not suicide, because we sometimes attach, I'm not saying it's your case, okay, but it is often the case, we attach a positive or a negative value to suicide. And therefore we say, no, Christ did not commit suicide. But of course it depends on the definition you give of suicide. And once again, this is a very complex question.
But they are tied together.
Sure, sure.
Our life is suicidious.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could ask, was it in the end, was it a free action or not? Was it intentional or not? If you say yes, it was intentional, it was a free action, then why would you deny that Socrates' death was a kind of suicide? But thanks for the question. Thanks again. Thank you.